Welcome to Breaking Paradigms, a podcast where we talk about global perspectives on spatial planning in practice and theory, by Constanze Frech and Kusché.
So today we will talk about realities of informality on different continents. And we chose a bit of a different format, more of a talking format, and we will give space to some voices from around the world and also share our own experiences. So, Constanze, do you remember how we even got to the topic of informality for the podcast?
Yeah, as far as I remember, this was basically one of the very first topics which came to our mind. We wanted to work on and with our podcast. As I remember, we both thought that this is a very important and very interesting topic, especially in urban planning, as it is the main reality of urban transformation in this world, even though in our daily routine as a Central European, we are not that conscious that this is the urban reality of cities around the world. But as we took a glimpse outside of Europe, we both know that this is a very important topic. And so this is how we both thought that this is very important. For me personally, informality in urban informal settlements are the most interesting way of exploring the needs of people. I realized that, especially as being an urban planner and being a person who should plan and do actually the opposite of informal settlement and unplanned city development, I realized that especially as an urban planner, you can learn a lot from informal settlements because they appear from a specific need and people build their environment the way they need it. And in my opinion, this is how we should develop cities, from the need of the people, and include the knowledge we gain about from our research, and also give some extra, which is going above the basic needs which are covered normally by the informal settlements, because most informal settlements have, for example, a lack of public space, and this is normally something which is really important for a community. But I think as an urban planner you can learn a lot from informal settlements and from what people need. And in my opinion, you can also see a lot the lack of state structure, basically. Because normally informal settlements appear when the state is not able to provide enough living space. So it's actually normally a mirror of showing the city's failure, actually.
I would actually like to add to your first point that you made, that I found it really interesting that the topic of informality, even though it is present also in the global north, is something that I really only came in touch with once I took a look around the global south, actually even before I started my education as a planner in depth. I realized how this reality of informality or unplanned settlements are something that we at the same time live with as a reality, also in the global north, that most of our cities were not planned. Of course, if you look towards the US and Canada, you find a lot more planned cities, but especially in Europe, where we are based, our communities, our cities, our towns are largely based on the needs of people. And I only came to this realization when I looked at the Global South for...
Yeah, that's very true. And actually, even if something is planned, normally urban planners try to take over the urban pattern and the urban fabric which is already existing, and actually try to imitate the natural structure of the city and the natural grown city. But
at the same time, when we look towards the global south, what the narrative very often is, especially within the planning community, is that, and maybe not necessarily just the planning community, but the political sphere especially, is that you need to formalize things, because there's other types of development that depend on formalization, especially when it comes to economic development, where measuring economic growth or lack thereof depends very much on having the numbers, and the numbers come from formalization. And so I think in that regard, that's something that's very, very specific and very important, not necessarily to the people who inhabit the informal settlements, but rather to the structures that they find themselves in, like you mentioned, with just having it also be a bit of a reflection on the state and how the state works.
Yeah, that's true. My very first experience with visiting a place which was described to me as a informal settlement was the favela Santa Marta in Rio de Janeiro. No, actually, the very first one was in Sao Paulo, which was partly formalized. And this was very interesting to me because this was... this showcased to me how difficult formalization processes actually are, because this favela was like partly formalized, and they basically tore it down and rebuilt new houses, but only half of it, and it basically this split the community and didn't help the people, or not the way it should, I guess. And then I went to Rio and saw Santa Marta, which is totally different favela, because this is the place where Michael Jackson did his video for the song "They Don't Care About Us." And this is a really, really interesting place for me, because on the one hand, it is still the favela it used to be, and it's still the place, it still has its specific
core
sphere,
structure.
Yeah, core structure, and also it's like it's especially like this typical vibe, I would say. But on the other hand, it totally became a touristy place because of this video. And interestingly, the people deal interestingly with it, and with like running hostels and sell this favela experience. And they also have like some souvenir shops and like anything you can think of. So this was for me an interesting mixture of, let's say, two worlds, but yeah, it was a really interesting experience. This was also
You did this as part of a university program, right?
Yeah, it was a university excursion, which was really, really interesting, and it was organized by Marcus Tomaselli. We already talked in the very first episode. And
I think that's really interesting, because it's very different to my first experience coming in contact with informality. Because my first experience was simply living in an informal settlement, whilst I was actually living, I would assume, in a formalized house. The settlement all around the house was, or the housing complex was actually informal. And I found it really interesting to see how people dealt with having different livelihood strategies. Because at that time, if you would look at any maps of that city that inhabited about 200,000 people, probably, of course there are no official numbers, but that's the estimates of the government of Lesotho at the time. And in that area, it was very interesting to see how the settlement really gave space to the needs of the people, both in terms of economic spaces that were created. Kind of, there was a market sphere, and there was a lot of urban agriculture going on, because most people, even though they did work in the factories that were very much formal and belonged to foreign investors, the majority of the housing is informal and therefore was not registered on any maps or anything like that. And for me, the interesting part with that was, first of all, like, food security was very important. So when there was a drought, it had a completely different effect than it would have, for example, in Austria. If there's a drought, maybe the availability of certain food groups is not as wide in the supermarket, but it didn't, or it normally doesn't affect the average citizen. You have to maybe adapt a little bit, but in general, you still have food security.
So it might be reflected in the prices,
yes,
but not in the availability.
Yeah, and there it was very much directly connected, and we will talk about urban agriculture probably in another episode. But for me, like, the interesting part of that was that at that moment when I lived there, I didn't really realize the effects that informality has, because it's such an everyday occurrence, and it's not something that is unique to one person's experience in that town or city. It's a very universal experience in the Global South. When you look at the numbers, I did my master thesis in Tanzania, and there they talk about 70% informal settlements and higher. So you get to see that this is actually a very very common thing and not something special. And then when we come in as planners and we try to formalize, or the government comes in and tries to formalize, we also create effects like what you were explaining, with also the differences in approaches. I saw approaches of simply being tolerated in Lesotho, where there was no real intervention while I was living there, neither towards the negative or the positives. It was just everyone was staying there. This is just the way that it was going on, and no one was bothered by having to be removed or anything like that. Whilst in South Africa, you saw huge housing programs that built these, what I would describe as sleep ghettos, because they didn't really provide space for livelihood strategies and were really mostly meant for providing for the need of housing, but didn't necessarily always take into consideration whether that is conducive to a functioning society. And so that was also a very different perspective, because on the one hand, there was a government that was trying to be active, was trying to invest money in housing for people and formalizing people. But it didn't seem necessarily that that was the better approach to just having an informal settlement. And I think that's also an interesting discussion to have, whether or not formalization necessarily has a positive effect for the local community.
Yeah. Now we could actually listen to some people's experiences in the countries we just talked about.
I'm Iris Gomez. I'm 37 years old, and I live in João Pessoa in Paraíba, Brazil. It's a state from northwest. I'm a teacher of political science and at the University of Federal of Paraíba, and I live with my son and my cat almost 2 years in that state. So how informality look like in my reality? It's a difficult question. I don't know. The informality seems like a poverty. I think. At least to my family, we don't think about this 3 years ago. It's a new phenomenon for us because we had a good economy and a good life, and I start welfare state or something like this, and 3 years we have this new reality. I don't know, it's new to me. So in some is this, the informality was not a merit for the middle class, and this is a recent phenomenon for us. And for the poor people, yes, just this has always been an important issue. In any case, informality sounds like precariousness, poverty, and vulnerability to me. And nowadays, there is a speech in Brazil that says that we don't have informality, but entrepreneurship. Who is unemployed and in poverty if he wants. It's a perverse speech that makes the government and society responsible for the situation of poverty and vulnerability. The idea that defends is that if you are all entrepreneurs, this is the solution. If you don't want, you are a problem. So to me, it's a dilemma, no? But I know that there are people that live in well with informality works. I don't know. To me, it's difficult. It means like a vulnerability, like poverty, because we have a smaller, short horizon than other young people.
My name is Thato, an architectural technologist from Lesotho. The informal settlement in Lesotho looks like a clustered organization of housing, whereby there are unplanned city setting, non-zone settlements that consist of all types of housing, including traditional architecture and modern architecture in same zones. And there are no municipality standards and recreational infrastructure. Because of this, planning of services flow and delivery becomes very expensive, and there is inconsistency of land distribution that results in houses, graveyards, and farming land being zoned in the same region. The impacts of informality on economic situation entails expensive services delivery, use of land inappropriately, increased criminal activities due to different lifestyles in the same zone. Apart from that, traffic jam on streets are increased, thus lowering the efficiency and productivity in the country. This also impacts low standard of living. Informal settlements also makes it costly to plan future town infrastructure because in some cases some houses need to be reconstructed somewhere else for delivery of infrastructure like tar roads, shopping complex, and other community developments. And proper sanitation also results due to very poor drainage systems found in this informality.
Maybe to add on that, I would like to add some experiences I had in China. I would say that China has a very specific situation concerning that. To be honest, I'm not totally sure about the status of most settlements I would see as informal settlement, because they're normally not really informal, because China has a very strict and a very strong mapping system, and also about their registration and residence permits and stuff like that. This is very strict in China. So this is not the same way informal as other settlements are. But still, there are settlements which are at least self-built. But interestingly, they have a very certain logic, which is very different from what I know from Brazil, or your stories from Africa, because they're built in a very similar way to the official houses, actually, because there's a very strong urban development culture, and how settlements and cities are built in China for thousands of years, basically. And so this was very interesting to me, that even though people were building themselves, and those settlements basically appeared probably more or less informal, they still had this very, very typical structure of this community-based system with like one main road, and then you have like some additional lanes going from that. So this was very interesting to me, that this is apparently a very strong cultural thing, how those settlements appear and how they develop. And for me, the biggest difference was also how the public or semi-public space was taken care of, basically. When you walk in the favela in Brazil, they normally don't have like public services concerning trash. So normally it's not the cleanest place. So it's normally you can find a lot of rubbish on the streets. And this is totally not the case in Chinese urban villages. They're always very, very not very, very clean, but at least pretty clean, actually. And I think this is a reflection of also the society of China as being a really collectively thinking people. And so the structure of the urban settlement reflects the society of the people.
I find that really interesting, because in a project that we did in Addis Ababa, in Ethiopia, I had an experience learning from an urban settlement structure that very much reminded me, now that you were talking about it, of this like communal thinking that was told to me by some local students at the university, who were telling us about a very specific structure within informal settlements that was basically based around the idea of communally shared space, which might not have been public as such, but as you would probably relate it, semi-public. So it was accessible to a certain amount of people who lived in the area, and that it was connected to sharing entrances, and it's a bit of a more complex topic. Maybe we'll talk about it in another episode. But the interesting thing, I think, is that culture actually seems to play a huge role also within informality, and how it's also seen, because I see huge differences between a lot of settlements in different African cities, and also the informal settlements, for example, in Latin American cities, where, for example, in a lot of African cities, maybe with some exceptions in West Africa, you find actually most of the buildings are in quite a good condition, and you will find settlements that have a certain amount of accessibility, maybe not by vehicles such as cars, but definitely on foot, that everything is reachable, and where very often it's more a topic of, for example, having geological issues, or being in unsafe environments, such as either naturally unsafe because of flooding, because of erosion or whatever, or on the other hand, human-made wastelands, let's call it that. And then when we talk about how a community actually engages with the space and forms their settlements, that also is I think, a big topic where also local realities play a huge role in creating these spaces. I think we'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
And we'll hand the question off to you. Maybe tell us in the comments, what are your experiences with informality? If you have some literature or videos or other media that you want to share, write us a comment and we'll be really happy to hear from you.
This was Breaking Paradigms by Constanze Frech and Sarah Kusché. Be part of the conversation. If you like what we do, consider supporting us and join our Patreon community. Special thanks to our supporters
Thomas Fischer.
Connect with us on Facebook, YouTube, and at breakingparadigms.org. Content and editing by Constanze Frech and Sarah Kusché. Sound design by Dídac Barroso and Florian Frech.